Hey everyone, welcome to my instructor feedback video for Module 11, Discussion 7 on cities. I felt like the discussion that you guys had this week was good, even though I am a doofus and I forgot to enable Carmen to separate all of you guys into your actual groups. I still thought that you guys talked about some good stuff. I also felt that the questions this week were relatively straightforward, just like the last week. There weren't particularly morally or like ethically dubious questions. Most of them were pretty straightforward and evidence-based. Um, but I still think the questions provided some good content to be talked about because there was actually some stuff on there that even I had to like go back and look up on my own, do a little bit of research outside of the materials that we had. So I will go over the questions now. Number one, describe the environment of ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern southern or modern day southern Iraq. What kind of landscape, resources, and climate did people experience 5,000 years ago? All right, so the this area in Mesopotamia, as we all know, is it's desert, um, but it's not like the kind of desert necessarily that we think of when we think of like I don't know, you're in the middle of the desert and you're lost and you can't find any water and you're dead because there's no resources. It's a desert, but it's also in this climate that's kind of wetter and a little. I think it's a little warmer, kind of going or warming up significantly from the last glacial maximum still. So this area was probably pretty easily habitable by people who lived there, and it was also benefited by the two rivers that ran circumnavigating Mesopotamia as well, the Tigris and Euphrates. So there was enough resources to get your water, basically. And river valleys are often really fertile because when river valleys flood, because they're usually on a floodplain, and then the water recedes, the area, the silt next to the waters is usually pretty fertile. So even though they lived in this desert climate, the area was still known as the Fertile Crescent because people could pretty easily, develop agriculture there. It was one of the cradles of agriculture that we see. So yeah, the climate was pretty favorable for living. However, as we'll get into in a second, even though it was favorable for living, we still had to, or the people who living there still had to transform their environment for their needs. So for question number two, pretty easy. Where did most people live after 3000 BC if they were Sumerian? Most people did live in cities. City-states started to crop up all around that Fertile Crescent region. So there were urban centers that were way more densely packed population-wise, and then there were still rural hinterlands. Like there were still people kind of living on the edges of cities, near to what we would think of as like a countryside type thing. But for the most part, people lived in city centers in this area, and there were like more than just one city center. There were like a lot of different city-states that ended up warring against each other at various times throughout the history of Mesopotamia. Where did Sumerian people get their water? Be very specific. What did they do to get water into their homes? So pretty much everybody got this. I mean, I'm not really going too much into group discussion because, like I said before, these are all relatively straightforward answers. But people got their water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and also from snowmelt from the mountains when the snow melted and then the rivers flooded and overflowed. But beyond that, the people who were living in the Fertile Crescent also built pretty advanced irrigation systems, canal systems for the time. Things that allowed them to transfer water from the rivers to these urban centers, nearer to their homes. So even though they did have water kind of like geographically close, just to make it more convenient for them and to allow them to farm further away from the river's edge, they had to create irrigation systems, which, like I said before, you guys did really well on. You guys all got that. How do people avoid cholera? Now, this is the one that I thought was a little difficult. I had to look it up myself because I didn't know anything about cholera in Mesopotamia. And I couldn't find any evidence online specifically of cholera in Mesopotamia. I mean, maybe it existed. We don't really have any evidence for it. It doesn't mean it didn't exist. We know with relative certainty that the first cholera outbreak, the first cholera pandemic, wasn't until a lot later. I think the first recorded pandemic outbreak was in India in the 1850s. So that's like way after this. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't waterborne illness in Mesopotamia. There were probably other sorts of bacteria that people had to deal with. Whenever you have a communal setting, like a city, it becomes a vector for waterborne illness because people like throw stuff out in communal water. People defecate and urinate in water, and all of these things create an environment that's relatively hazardous for people drinking the water. So was cholera specifically in Mesopotamia? Maybe. I don't know. I couldn't find any evidence. But was waterborne illness still a problem? Yeah. Especially depending on where the Mesopotamian people got their water. If they were getting their water directly from the Tigris, directly from the Euphrates, it was probably less of a problem. But if they were using communal wells in the middle of city centers, it was most likely more of a problem. Which brings us to the next and last question. Can you suggest 3 reasons why Sumerians drank wine and beer? 4 reasons, even. Yeah, some people did a good job of coming up with 4 reasons instead of 3. Pretty much everybody said, and this is like the most obvious one, but most of the people stated that people drank wine and beer for celebratory reasons. Usually, wine and beer is a good reason to come together. Or I guess like maybe wine and beer specifically isn't the reason, but people drink wine and beer when coming together to celebrate things. So it's a good source of unity. They also drank wine and beer for ritual reasons, in order to promote certain like gods or deities. Beer was used as a sacrifice sometimes to these deities. Beer was used as trade because people like to drink beer recreationally. And something else also that like fewer people also got, I thought, but was also important is that beer and wine were used because they were safe to drink. And that's something that I don't think we think about as much. But instead of going to your local well and drinking water that you had to boil, you could just drink beer or wine more readily because the alcohol content would get rid of the bacteria. So that's definitely a reason as well. I think that's basically it. I mean, like, one of the other things that you guys said, which I thought was also a really good reason that people probably drank wine and beer, was because there was a surplus of grain. And if there was a surplus of grain or barley or whatever they were using to concoct these alcoholic drinks, it would be better to turn it into something rather than just let it, like, rot or to let it build up in a storehouse where nothing is going to happen to it. So yeah, especially in times of plenty, it was a mark of a mark of bounty, I guess, for lack of a better term. So yeah, and I think that is it as far as the questions go. Good job on the discussion this week. Like I said in my other video, there's no outright discussion this week, but keep working on those posters, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. Thanks for listening.